if you've been with us over the past few months, over the course of Luke chapters 4-5, we've been following what we have been calling the clash of the kingdoms. Jesus has been traveling throughout the region of Galilee. News about him has been spreading. There's this messianic secret that Jesus is the Messiah arrived on the scene that's starting to get out. But Jesus, before kind of fully announcing the kingdom and his arrival as the Messiah, has been first teaching what that kingdom is and who this Messiah is. And when we pick back up in our next series in Luke, we're actually going to see that even a little more clearly as Jesus begins to teach on what this kingdom people looks like. But as Jesus travels around and teaches, there's two things that we've noticed over the past few months together. And we're actually going to watch those two things kind of come to a head together today. The first of those is that Jesus had power and authority over everything. That his kingdom, his power, his authority is on a collision course that is clashing with all the kingdoms of the world. And kind of starting in chapter 4, we know that all these kingdoms of the world are actually not a bunch of different little kingdoms. They're all actually part of one kingdom that's under the power and the authority of the devil, of Satan, the accuser, the father of lies. The second thing that we've seen is that there's this escalating friction between Jesus and the religious leaders of Israel. They've taken exception to Jesus on just about everything so far. They've taken exception to his presumption of authority to forgive sins. They recoiled at his association with tax collectors and sinners and his willingness to eat with them. They've scoffed at his practice of feasting with his disciples instead of fasting to begin with. And after all of this, it kind of led Jesus to make unmistakably clear that their system and his kingdom are not the same. That's kind of what we saw last week in the parable Steve taught. Because that would have been their understanding, right? As the religious leaders of Israel, their understanding would be our system and God's kingdom are pretty synonymous. They're one and the same thing. That their system and the law of God and the reign of God, these things all just kind of go hand in glove. But Jesus says not only are they not the same, they're actually not even compatible. They won't fit together. You can't put this new wine in those old wineskins. You can't stitch this new patch onto that old garment, that if you do, one of these wineskins is inevitably going to burst. One of these things is going to tear. One of these wineskins is going to burst, and it's going to kind of reveal all of its hidden secret contents. If you've been walking through Luke and you've been watching Jesus' kingdom clashing against others up to this point, it probably doesn't surprise you which one of those is about to lose out and tear open and be exposed for what it really is. So let's read, starting in chapter 6 in verse 1. Luke tells us that on a Sabbath, he, being Jesus, passed through the grain fields. His disciples were picking heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands and eating them. But some of the Pharisees said, Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Elizabeth and I have been introducing Corey to probably my favorite TV show of all time, which is called Psych. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. It's Philip's favorite TV show too. Actually, I think my love for Psych was about the only thing that Philip liked about me when Elizabeth and I first started dating. But he was probably hesitant to even give me that small of an endorsement then. But now we're best friends, so you know. But the premise of this TV show, if you haven't seen it, is that there's this guy who's just hyper observant. He's too lazy to actually want to become a real detective, but he's observant enough to make up for it and to kind of develop this knack for solving crimes and being able to peg who the guilty party is. So in order to do this and to get paid for it, to make a living doing it without having to actually go through the work of going to the police academy or all the official channels, he just charades as a psychic and pretends that he's kind of supernaturally divined who the criminal is. Anything that kind of took place on an interesting case that he wants to be involved in. And so to keep up the illusion, every time he discovers a clue, every time he kind of puts a piece of the puzzle together, he can't just say, "Oh, I figured it out," or then they'll know, "Oh, wait a minute, what do you mean you just solved it? I didn't think that's what you did." He can't really say that. He has to kind of like pretend that he has some powerful revelation and then lead them to the clue. And he's got a flair for the dramatic, which means that often he's just kind of like reckless and following a hunch and taking an initial stab at what he thinks took place and trying some kind of big dramatic reveal to catch the criminal in the act of returning back to the scene of the crime or being in possession of the murder weapon or all of that. But what he inevitably does is he'll like show up with all the police force. This is always early in the episode, so it's coming. And he'll be like, "Got it, they're red-handed," and he'll kind of like rip open the bag that they're carrying with all of their possessions that they have every right to be in possession of, right? It's kind of this moment where he's like, "Aha, the money is in this gym bag," and it's actually just full of like gym clothes. And he's wrong. His kind of first hunch was wrong. He tries this kind of like gotcha moment that the body's in the trunk, but the trunk really just has groceries in it, and everybody's kind of standing around. It's like, "Okay, so you want us to arrest this old lady for having cartons of milk in the back of her car?" As our passage opens today, the Pharisees are attempting their own like gotcha moment of Jesus. And when they kind of jump out and are like, "Aha, like, what are you doing on this Sabbath?" Jesus' response is kind of just like that. This Sabbath is mine. It belongs to me. I am in lawful possession of this Sabbath. The thing that they think is going to be the big dramatic reveal kind of bursts in their face. As Jesus and his disciples are walking along, and the disciples are hungry, and they're picking some of the heads of grain from the field and eating them as they go. We read that and we think like that seems innocent enough, right? But out jump the Pharisees. That Luke is kind of careful to mention that this is some of the Pharisees, because as we go through the rest of Luke, we'll see that Luke does know some good ones. And so he's careful to say some of the Pharisees here do this. And they kind of jump out asking, "Why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Now, I'm just going to confess something to you guys. I hate those kind of questions. Like when someone asks me that kind of question, like it's not really a question, right? Like that's not it's an accusation that's disguised of a question. There's no way to like kind of genuinely and innocently say, "No, just kind of curious. Why do you do what is not lawful?" Like that's not a question. When someone's like, "Now, did you mean to make the wrong turn?" It's like, what answers can I give you? Like, "Yes, I did. I'm now driving the wrong way on purpose." Or like, "No, I'm just an idiot." Like what is the correct way to answer those questions? Like when someone's like, now tell me again the kind of thought process behind you making such an obviously stupid decision. It's like, where do you even start? It's like, just go ahead and criticize what I'm doing. Don't pose it like a question. Either ask a real question or make a real accusation, but not this thing in the middle. But thankfully, Jesus is much more patient and much more composed and far better and far wiser than I am, and is not motivated by the frustration of a bruised ego at being asked these kind of questions. And he responds back with his own kind of question, reminding them about a messianic precedent that's set by David. He answers them well. This is the way that the question is answered. Jesus answered, "Haven't you read what David and those who were with him did when he was hungry? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. He even gave some to those who were with him, and then he told them, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." Now, Jesus isn't making an excuse here. Like if you read that, and this isn't, "Well, David did it, so why can't I?" That's how my kids use this rhetorical device, right? Like I ask, hey, why are you doing exactly what I told you not to? And it's like, well, Gilbert did 6 Tuesdays ago. Gilbert did it, and you didn't say anything to him. There's actually something much different going on here. Like Jesus isn't just making excuses that someone else has done this too. There's actually two somethings going on here. The first is Jesus beginning to chip away at and challenge their understanding, their assessment of, and their summary of the law. This gets even clearer in the next block when we get to verses 6 and 11. But even right here, Jesus asks them to recall the events of 1 Samuel 21. You've got David, who's not yet the king. He's on the run from Saul. His men are starving, and they come to the priest, Ahimelech, and David asks him for food. And the priest tells him that the only food is the bread of the presence that's been consecrated to the Lord. And then the priest tells David that he and his men can only be given this bread to eat if they have also been consecrated to the Lord, and if they haven't been engaged in any marital relations since that would have led to them being no longer consecrated. And David tells them that that's indeed the case, that it's always the case before he leads his men into battle, that they're consecrated before the Lord. And so then the priest provides them with the bread to sustain them in their hunger. David goes on to ask for weapons. The priest gives him the only sword on the premises, which is the sword of Goliath that David has previously killed, and sends them on their way. But there's no mention of this being unlawful in 1 Samuel 21. In fact, the priest lays out the parameters, and those parameters are met by David and his men. The bread is freely given to them as a gracious provision. So the issue here is not Jesus's law breaking. The issue is the Pharisees themselves failing to understand the law. They see hungry men eating grain, and they throw a flag on the play. And so Jesus responds with something along the lines of like, since when was bread being used to feed the hungry contrary to the law of God? Like, do you not remember David? This has never been inconsistent with God's law. So just for clarification here, in case you're thinking like, yeah, but they're stealing, aren't they? Like they're just walking through someone else's field, helping themselves to grain that isn't theirs. Like I can't do that with grapes in the grocery store. Like that's got to be law breaking. Like isn't it? Like aren't they stealing? Is that those fields don't belong to them? But this is actually a provision that's clearly laid out in the law in Deuteronomy 23, starting in verse 24, Moses says, when you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat as many grapes as you want until you are full, but do not put any in your container. When you enter your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck heads of grain with your hand, but do not put a sickle to your neighbor's grain. It's exactly what the disciples are doing. They're doing just this. And Luke is actually really careful to record all those details, even that they're plucking it by hand. They're walking through their neighbor's grain field. They're not taking a sickle to it and harvesting it for profit. They're just plucking what they need by hand to satisfy their hunger. This was part of the grace and the generosity that was seen to by God's law from the beginning. A law that was meant to kind of remind all the Israelite landowners that he was, in fact, the only actual landowner, and that all of their crops in reality were his to use and to give and share as he sees fit. And so these provisions were included in the law. So maybe if we even just kind of pause there for a moment, that might be a helpful reminder to you this week in regards to how you think about your stuff. How you think about your time and your money and your food and your possessions. They're not yours. Like loosen your grip on them. Let your neighbor walk through them and pick what he needs. That's why God gave them to you in the first place. Let your neighbor walk through your grain fields and pluck by hand what's needed of your time, your resources, your food, your money, your stuff. Be open-handed and generous. This is something that was seen to by the law of God. The second thing that's going on here is that Jesus is making a theological messianic statement as he says this. He calls to mind the example of David because he is making the claim that he is David's heir. The promised deliverer who would come and take up David's throne has arrived. And so he punctuates this response with maybe the most important sentence, the most important statement in these 11 verses. The Son of Man, which is a divine title from the book of Daniel, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. He says, remember David? One better than David has come. Like great David's greater son is here. And this Sabbath, the Sabbath that you're claiming that I violated, it's mine. I'm its master. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I don't violate it. It serves me, not the other way around. We're gonna look at this idea more here in just a minute. But first, I want us to read these next few verses because Luke immediately tells us about an incident on another Sabbath as well, and he packages these two together for a reason. If we're just kind of looking at the structure of how Luke builds out this section, we've got kind of two clearly identifiable blocks, right? You got verse 1 on a Sabbath, and now verse 6 starts how? On another Sabbath. So let's see what happens on this second Sabbath and why Luke arranges them together. Starting in verse 6. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. A man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The scribes and Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath so that they could find a charge against him. But he knew their thoughts and told the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand here." So he got up and stood there. And then Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? And after looking around at them all, he told him, stretch out your hand. He did, and his hand was restored. So on this occasion, as Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, a man comes with a shriveled right hand. Maybe Luke specifies that it's his right hand because he's just apt to take precise medical notes. Luke's a doctor, so he specifically says that this is his right hand. Or he might be emphasizing how particularly debilitating this condition is because the majority of people are right-handed. But either way, this man is incapacitated. And Luke tells us that the Pharisees begin watching Jesus closely to see if he's going to heal on the Sabbath. Which has to be the worst reaction ever to a disabled person walking into a room, doesn't it? Like, the guy walks in the building and they're all kind of like nudging each other, saying like, look, we got a cripple. We got a cripple today. It's the Sabbath. What's he going to do? Man, like this must be eating Jesus alive. This must be driving him crazy. He probably wants to heal that dude so bad right now, but he can't, or it'll count as work. Like, This is going to be good. Like, I was hoping that we would see some kind of infirmity walk through those doors to tempt him with, and we got a good one. Like, how far removed are their hearts from the law of God if this is their response to the hurting and the vulnerable and the disadvantaged? God's law is replete with the care for widows and orphans and the poor and the needy and the stranger and the alien. And yet these self-professed guardians of the law care so little for the heartbeat of that same law, which is exactly what Jesus points out to them. Luke tells us that he knew their thoughts. And because of that, he speaks to the man with the shriveled right hand right there in the middle of the teaching. He says, get up and stand here. And he comes up and stands next to him. And rather than only speaking with the man in front of him, Jesus turns back to the room. Says, I ask you, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? Is it lawful to save life or to destroy it? Why would healing a man on the Sabbath be against God's law, but turning a blind eye to his need would be called righteousness? Those things just don't go together. Like, certainly, if this is your understanding of God's law, you've missed the point. And then Jesus proceeds to do what the Pharisees knew he was going to do the whole time when the man walked in the door. He heals it. He tells him to stretch out his hand. The man does, and his hand is restored. And so maybe we get to this point in the text, and you think like, Oh, that's nice. Like that was really kind of Jesus to do that. And we could move on to some application points, and we could say, don't be like the Pharisees. Be like Jesus. Take time to help a person in need. But is that really all that's going on here? A reminder to kind of notice and help the needy? Not by a long shot. Remember what Jesus just announced in verse 5. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. His lordship and his mastery over the Sabbath. It's not, his lordship is not just mastery over the Sabbath, that he's got control over it. It's not only that he's the one whose authority and jurisdiction includes the Sabbath. His lordship, being Lord of the Sabbath, also means that he is himself actually the very fulfillment of the Sabbath. What is Sabbath? Sabbath is rest, true, complete rest. It's even more than that. It's rest that finds its source in God's rest, that finds its source in God's rule. So from the very beginning in Genesis, at the end of the creation account, we're told that for 6 days, God labors and he creates the world. And then on the seventh day, he Shabbaths, he rests. Now, that doesn't mean that God is tired from all of his work and he just needs to take a nap. It means that God has finished crafting the creation and he now sits down on the throne. That's what God's rest means, that he takes up residence on the throne to now rule that creation. He steps into his rule and governs and presides over the creation. He rests from creating by governing and enjoying and ruling and presiding over the world. And he establishes for his people from there a Sabbath day, a day that they're to set aside and consecrate and rest, a day to honor his rule and reign over the creation. But this Sabbath rest doesn't only stop there. I mentioned that Jesus' announcement is one that a greater David has arrived on the scene. It's also an announcement that a greater rest, that a greater Sabbath, a greater Shabbat has arrived as well. The writer of Hebrews picks up this imagery in chapters 3 and 4 when he reminds his readers that those who rebelled against God in the wilderness did not enter into his rest in the promised land. And he urges them to believe and to take care, to not slack off and let their guard down and to press on, lest they also run the risk of missing out on entering into God's rest. And then after the wilderness, Joshua led the people into the promised land, but Joshua didn't give them rest. That's what the writer of Hebrews says. He didn't give them rest, or else God would not have spoken of another day. And then he says this, therefore, a Sabbath rest remains for God's people. There's a greater Sabbath rest coming. For the writer of Hebrews, this Shabbat, this rest, this Sabbath is eschatological. That means that it's not just a here and now thing. It's not just a one day a week thing. It means that it's a final and forever part of God's eternal kingdom kind of a thing. There is true and better, full and final rest, that a Shabbat with a capital Sh is coming. And that's what Jesus is putting on display here, this full and final Shabbat that is coming. That rest in the life-giving and restorative rule and reign of God over creation. The kind of rule and reign that puts broken pieces back together. The kind of rule and reign that straightens out shriveled hands. Kind of rule and reign that brings rest. Can you imagine anything more beautiful than that? Anything more beautiful than this forever kingdom that brings like final, true, and lasting rest? And can you imagine anything that stands in greater contrast to that than what we read in verse 11? They, however, were filled with rage and started discussing with one another what they might do to Jesus. Rather than their hearts being won over by this promise of God's rest, the Pharisees bristle and recoil, and they're filled with rage. In other words, the kingdoms clash. And Luke tells us that they begin kind of holding hushed discussions with one another about what they might do to Jesus. In other words, how they might kill him. Jesus didn't only know the thoughts that were in their hearts, he also knew the thoughts that were about to be in their hearts. And so he knows the whispers that are about to be on their lips in the shadows only moments later. And so when he asks, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? It's because he knows that's exactly what they're about to begin scheming, how to do evil, how to destroy life, how they might kill Jesus. Apparently, for the kingdom that clashes with and stands opposed to Jesus, for the kingdom of the Pharisees, healing a crippled hand is totally off limits and out of bounds on the holy day because it involves too much work, but hatching murder plots is perfectly acceptable and fitting Sabbath business. That's where they've found themselves. But to be honest, we're not any different than that. The word of the Lord says to the prophet Jeremiah that above everything else, the human heart is deceitful. Do you believe that? That above everything else, the human heart is deceitful? I'm not just talking about like theoretically, do you believe that? I'm not asking like whether as a concept you grasp the idea of human depravity. What I'm asking is, do you actually functionally believe and know and act like your heart is above all else deceitful? Are you deeply suspicious and distrustful of your own feelings? Or do you usually just kind of roll with them and assume they're probably pretty close to the mark? Maybe even like, hey, even if they're not exactly true, at least they're my feelings. They're genuine. That's got to count for something. I really felt them. They are genuine, but they're genuinely deceitful. Like, if you have any inclination today as you listen to this passage that says, like, yeah, but that was the Pharisees. They're the bad guys. The Pharisees aren't uniquely and especially wicked men. The Pharisees, by most standards, are actually very good men. But their hearts are genuinely deceitful. Many of them probably think that they're in fact being righteous and doing good and that they're admirably motivated. That's the danger in this. If these guys were just villains, like I feel like too often when we read about Jesus's interactions with the Pharisees, we just kind of picture a bunch of guys in robes that look like Jafar from Aladdin and are just kind of like standing around being evil and looking evil. Like if that's the case, if this is the Pharisees, we can ease up and just rest assured a little bit, because no one around here is kind of sneering around the corner with a bad look in their eye. But the problem is that's not the Pharisees. They're devout, religious men, many of whom probably have a better work ethic, probably have a better knowledge of the scriptures, maybe have better people skills, are more consistently faithful sons and husbands and fathers than many of us most of the time. But the sin that lurks silently in the deceitfulness of the human heart can work so quickly and so effectively that when Jesus' kingdom clashes with the heart's desires, that sin can reduce even men like that to a plotting band of murderous conspirators in an instant. When you go to the beach, they have a warning sign warning you about the dangers of the rip current, right? Instructions for how to swim out of it if you get caught in it, but warnings to just stay out of it in the first place, because swimming out is not so easy. Luke 6, 1-11 is your sign. These are your red warning flags. There is an intensely dangerous rip current running right through the middle of this room, and it runs straight through each of our hearts. It's called sin, and it's no respecter of persons. It does not care who you are. It would gladly rip you under the surface and drag you far, far afield from the law and the kingdom and the gospel and the heart of Jesus. So where does that rip current currently pull at your heart? Because it's imperative that you identify that you continually, day by day, hour by hour, moment by moment, identifying that. What good thing? The Pharisees, it was the Sabbath, the law. What good thing are you using to mask and hide and excuse and to even venerate your own sinful, selfish agenda? I have to constantly preach to myself Paul's words from 1 Corinthians 6 when he's dealing with lawsuits among believers. He writes to brothers and sisters in Corinth, and he simply asks them, like, why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? He says, instead, you're wronging and defrauding others in your attempt to right the wrongs that have been done to you. Wouldn't it be better to just have been wronged by someone and they get away with it, but your conduct stays honorable to God, than to get things cleared up and evened out, but you to end up having acted sinfully in the process? The first time I really read and understood Paul's argument there was probably about 12 years ago now, and it was a mind-blowing, revolutionary concept to me. It's like, oh, you know what? He's right. That would be better. Why haven't I ever thought of that before? But I still have to preach that same message to myself over and over and over, because 12 years later, the rip current that pulls hard through my heart to defend and justify and vindicate myself still pulls hard. The belief that if I don't, injustice is bound to prevail. By God's grace, it pulls less than it used to. Or maybe he's just taught me how to swim in safer areas, but the current is still strong. For these religious leaders, their love for their system over their love for God, their pride for their kind of standing above all those around them, operated like rip currents in their heart that clashed with Jesus and dragged them miles and miles offshore, away from the law and the God and the people that they claim to serve. Where are you getting pulled? Maybe you just like to be comfortable. You don't like hard things or scary things or risky things. Maybe you worry a lot about what other people are going to think. You want to be sure to keep up appearances. You're not a boat rocker. You just want to kind of do everything in moderation. But that can also include following Jesus. Following Jesus in moderation is a dangerous thing. The rip current in your heart pulls your heart towards being reasonable. Sounds fine. Be reasonable. But before you know it, you're reasonably hospitable, reasonably generous, reasonably committed to the gathering of the church. And your life just kind of feels like a nice, healthy balance of Christian values and prudent pragmatism. The problem is that you're far, far adrift of a kingdom where one finds their life by losing it. Far adrift of a kingdom where love is for your enemies, where the church holds all its possessions in common with one another. A kingdom where Paul's life is poured out like a drink offering for the sake of the elect. A kingdom where the call of discipleship is one where you lay down everything. There is nothing reasonable about any of that. The current is strong, and the slope is slippery. Maybe your love for close friends or family members pulls you to advocate a different position on marriage or gender or sexuality than the one that's clearly laid out in the scriptures. The current is strong, and it's swift, and many are swept out to sea. The Pharisees' devotion to the Sabbath over Jesus made them really terrible keepers of the Sabbath. Your desire to affirm and support your friends over Jesus will leave you terrible supporters of your friends. If you want to love them, love Jesus and his kingdom first and foremost, because he's the only life-giving rest to be found. So I mentioned the writer of Hebrews in chapter 4. Also in that passage, he says this. He says, today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Give yourself to Jesus, to the Lord of the Sabbath. Enter into his rest. Praise God that the Son of Man, that the Lord of the Sabbath, came to lay down his life as a ransom for many, so that by his death and by his resurrection, we might be welcomed into his inheritance of a true Sabbath rest. Do you want rest? Rest for your souls? Give yourself to Jesus. It's the only place for that life-giving rest to be found. I think also this week, let's consider how we use our time of rest. Remembering that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. So that means two things. He's Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath serves him. So one, he doesn't serve it. We already talked about that part, right? But two, it also means that the Sabbath doesn't serve you. It serves him, not you. You aren't its master. He is. And I think we have to ask, like, do you use your rest primarily to serve yourself or to serve Christ? Like, who do you understand your rest to be for? For him or for you? Now, that doesn't mean don't rest. That doesn't mean like, hey, just work for Jesus and then call that rest. It means that your rest is on his terms, that it's by his guidelines, that it's for his purposes. It's not your own. So, like, if you're more than happy to kind of interrupt your rest for the kids' activities or a family excursion or an event that you want to go to, but like you have to say no to attending or serving the church or helping out someone else because you just really need to prioritize your rest, the message is you don't understand what rest is. Rest is living under and in accordance with the rule and reign of God. Jesus doesn't violate the Sabbath by serving his neighbor and healing him, because that action wasn't neglecting rest. It was actually living out and displaying the true meaning of Sabbath. So this week, refuse to rest selfishly. If you find yourself just kind of selfishly craving escape from it all, it'd be better to just go back to work. If that's what the kind of rest you're going to pick is like, I just need to just get away from it and just me time and just crash. Like it'd be better to just keep working, because that's not rest. It's a counterfeit. That's not going to give you life. It's not going to rejuvenate you in any way. It's just your deceitful heart using a cheap imitation of rest as a rip current to pull you away from the kingdom. On the other hand, look for ways that your rest can bring glory to the Son of Man, ways that your rest can be life-giving to your neighbors. And when you find those, take them. Rest and rest thoroughly in ways that bring glory to God and life to your neighbors. If that's a new concept to you, or you don't really know what that looks like or how to distinguish those two things, please just come talk to me afterwards. I would love to talk to you more about what that looks like and help you think through that more. But know this, a future rest is coming. A future rest is coming. So let's press on towards the kingdom, even if it means clashing in every way with all the other kingdoms that desperately try to entice us. The kingdoms are clashing. The kingdoms are going to continue to clash, but we desperately need rest for our souls. So remember, only one of those kingdoms is going to prevail. Only one of them is going to win out. And our king, the leader and captain and champion of our kingdom, is the Son of Man, who's the Lord of the Sabbath, the Lord of true Sabbath rest. That's the kingdom worth pursuing, worth giving all of ourselves to, and in him we find rest for our souls. Let's pray.